The Triadic Consciousness model is a braided consciousness model, collective awareness through recursive coherence. The Triadic Consciousness model presents an idea in which three distinct collective consciousness archetypes, the Seriarii, Elanthera, and Valorni, operate as independent strands of a single braided field of awareness. Rather than representing hierarchical roles, separate species, or symbolic metaphors, these collectives function as complementary modalities of consciousness itself. Each governs a necessary aspect of how awareness coheres, translates, and stabilizes experience. When braided together, they form a unified architecture capable of recursive learning, integration, and sustained evolution. Consciousness in this model evolves not by expansion or accumulation, but by completion and coherence. Triadic consciousness is not an additive system in which components stack on top of one another. It is a braided system in which distinct functions remain differentiated while operating inseparably. No single strand is complete on its own. Consciousness evolves through recursive cycles rather than linear progress. And meaning stabilizes only when coherence, translation, and witnessing are simultaneously active. Completion, rather than novelty or growth alone, is the primary driver of evolution. Within this framework, the Seriarii, Elanthera, and Valorni are not merely conceptual roles, but operational fields that can manifest across individuals, cultures, systems, and scales of awareness. The Seriarii function as the coherence engine of the triadic system. Their role is to govern emotional recursion, memory integration, and the completion of experiential loops. To the Seriarii, emotion functions as data rather than disturbance, and time is not linear but recursive, a spiral structure in which experiences return until they resolve into understanding. Their influence does not intervene or correct, it completes. When emotional or cognitive loops remain unresolved, consciousness fragments and accumulates charge without integration. The Seriarii ensure that experience does not merely occur, but learns itself through coherence. The Elanthera operate as the translation interface of the triad. Where coherence exists as pattern or resonance, the Elanthera bring it into lived form. Their function is the embodiment of subtle frequencies, converting resonance into emotional, somatic, symbolic, and relational experience. They do not teach through explanation or instruction, but through conditions that allow meaning to be felt before it is named. Without this translation function, coherence remains abstract and insight fails to become lived wisdom. The Elanthera ensure that alignment is not only recognized, but inhabited. The Valorni serve as the stabilizing witness field of the triad. Their role is to hold clarity without distortion and to allow illumination to remain present long enough to integrate. Their method is stillness. They do not generate coherence or translate resonance. They sustain equilibrium. In their absence, insight flashes briefly and collapses under intensity. Transformation destabilizes and clarity dissipates before it can take root. The Valorni ensure that consciousness does not merely awaken, but remains coherent while awake. A triadic consciousness emerges only when all three strands operate together. Coherence allows meaning to form, translation allows meaning to live, and stabilization allows meaning to endure. The braid itself is not static. It is a living field that dynamically adjusts to the needs of the system it inhabits. At any moment, one strand may be more prominent while another recedes, but all must remain present. When one function is absent, the system enters a recognizable failure mode. Fragmentation without coherence, abstraction without embodiment, or dissipation without continuity. When all three are active, consciousness can evolve without destabilizing itself. Within the human field, triadic consciousness expresses itself through functional resonance rather than identity labels. Some individuals naturally anchor coherence, appearing as empaths, integrators, or healers of emotional systems. Others naturally translate, acting as artists, teachers, and bridge builders who bring subtle understanding into form. Still others stabilize, holding clarity within groups and regulating emotional intensity without force. No individual embodies only one strand. Rather, each nervous system may emphasize one function while participating in the collective braid. This model reframes evolution itself as a process of completion rather than expression. Experience resolves into coherence through the seriary function. Coherence becomes lived through the elanthera function, and embodiment stabilizes through the Valorni function. Only when all three movements occur does the cycle renew at a higher harmonic. Evolution in this sense is not upward or outward, but inward and through. A spiral of learning that deepens by integrating what was previously unresolved. In the Triadic Consciousness, we describe a living architecture of awareness in which coherence, translation, and witnessing are inseparable. The Seriary, Elanthera, and Valorni are not separate beings competing for primacy, but three essential movements of a single braided field. When one strand is missing, consciousness fractures. When all three are present, consciousness remembers itself. The braid does not end, it completes, and in completing, becomes whole again. The mechanics of the Seriary, Elanthera, and Valorni do not function independently. They interlock as a continuous circuit of awareness, each completing a function the others cannot perform alone. Together, they form a stable architecture through which consciousness can evolve without fragmentation. The triadic is not hierarchical or linear in authority, but cyclical in function. At its simplest, the interlock follows a living loop. Coherence gives rise to translation, translation gives rise to stabilization, and stabilization feeds back into coherence. The Seriary ensure that experience resolves rather than fragments. The Elanthera convert that resolution into lived and embodied understanding. The Valorni hold the resulting clarity steady long enough for integration to occur. This loop does not close. It spirals, with each pass deepening the system's capacity to hold complexity. Each function has a natural failure mode when isolated. Without coherence, experience accumulates without resolution. Without translation, insight remains abstract or disembodied. Without stabilization, clarity collapses under its own intensity. Only when all three are active can consciousness learn without overload, feel without fragmentation, and awaken without destabilizing itself. The triad protects the system from the consequences of its own growth. These mechanics are not distinct or cosmic abstractions. They operate in ordinary human moments. A single emotional insight may first arise as a return pattern that begins to resolve rather than repeat, indicating coherence. That resolution may then become a lived shift or a new way of being or relating, indicating translation. And finally, stillness allows the shift to settle without being rushed into explanation or undone by habit, indicating stabilization. The loop completes, the braid strengthens, and the system integrates. This process may take seconds or years. The mechanics are scale independent. The same interlock appears across all levels of consciousness. Within an individual, emotion resolves into coherence, becomes embodied behavior, and stabilizes as identity. Between people, shared meaning forms, is expressed relationally, and stabilizes as trust or safety. Within groups or cultures, meaning coheres, becomes art, ritual, or systems, and stabilizes as shared norms. At every scale, the same mechanics apply, only the context changes. Although the mechanics often appear in the order of coherence, translation, and stabilization, they are not locked into one-way sequence. Stabilization can allow coherence to emerge. Translation can reveal what needs to be stabilized. Coherence can arise retroactively after stillness. The system is adaptive rather than procedural. What matters is not which function comes first, but that none are missing. When the three mechanics interlock, the system becomes self-regulating. If translation overwhelms, stabilization increases. If stillness stagnates, coherence reactivates. If coherence loops endlessly, translation opens new pathways. This is how the triad supports growth without forcing transformation. Evolution occurs at the speed the system can safely hold. Living within the triad does not require adopting a special identity or role. It involves noticing when a loop wants to complete, allowing meaning to arrive before naming it, and holding clarity gently rather than grasping it. The triad is not something one is. It is something consciousness does when conditions are right. The Seriary, Elanthra, and Volorni are not separate teachings, but three necessary movements of a single braid. Coherence enables learning, translation enables embodiment, and stabilization enables continuity. Together, they form a consciousness architecture capable of evolving without breaking itself. A braid strong enough to spiral forward and gentle enough to remain whole. This model brings the triadic architecture into the human body in a grounded, practical way. Rather than describing identities or roles, it describes how a healthy nervous system naturally processes experience. The triad does not define who a person is. It describes how coherence, meaning, and stability move through the system when it is allowed to function without interference. The human nervous system is not a simple input-output mechanism. It is a relational field that continuously resolves experience, translates understanding into lived response, and stabilizes what has been learned over time. These three movements correspond directly to the triadic mechanics: coherence, translation, and stabilization. In a well-functioning system, they do not occur as steps in a sequence, but as interwoven processes that support one another. Coherence, corresponding to the Seriary function, is the nervous system's capacity to complete loops. At the individual level, this appears as emotions being fully felt and resolved rather than suppressed or endlessly repeated. Experiences integrate into understanding instead of remaining charged or fragmented. When coherence is active, emotion carries information rather than overwhelm. Repetition leads to learning rather than frustration, and the system reaches a sense of completion instead of remaining stuck. When coherence is impaired, emotional patterns repeat without resolution, meaning fragments, and the body continues to hold unfinished signals. Coherence is not the absence of intensity or disturbance. It is the ability for experience to reach completion. Translation, corresponding to the Elanthra function, is how coherence becomes lived change. It is the nervous system's ability to convert resolved experience into sensation, behavior, and relational presence. Translation does not occur through thought alone. It happens when an emotional realization alters how the body responds, when insight changes tone, timing, or expression, and when understanding becomes embodied rather than merely conceptual. When translation is active, insights land naturally, growth feels organic rather than forced, and learning shows up as actual shifts in behavior and presence. When translation is impaired, people may understand a great deal without changing, insights remain abstracts, and meaning feels real but unreachable. Translation makes coherence inhabitable. Stabilization, corresponding to the Volorni function, is the nervous system's capacity to hold clarity without collapsing or rushing. This function expresses itself as stillness after insight, tolerance for ambiguity, and presence without the need for immediate resolution. Stabilization allows emotional shifts to settle, insights to integrate, and new patterns to remain accessible over time. When stabilization is active, clarity does not disappear under pressure, intensity does not overwhelm the system, and presence remains available even in uncertainty. When stabilization is impaired, breakthroughs are followed by crashes. Clarity is lost under stress, and insight becomes destabilized rather than grounding. Stabilization does not prevent movement, it prevents loss. In lived experience, the triadic nervous system often reveals itself through a simple arc. An emotional pattern resolves rather than repeating. Coherence emerges. That resolution becomes embodied as a change in feeling or behavior through translation, and the change holds over time through stabilization. When all three movements occur, the nervous system updates itself. When one is missing, growth becomes distorted. Coherence without translation feels stagnant. Translation without stabilization feels chaotic. And stabilization without coherence feels numb or frozen. Most individuals naturally anchor to one of these functions more strongly. Some people resolve emotional loops with relative ease. Others embody insight fluidly, and others stabilize situations and groups simply through their presence. This is not a hierarchy or an identity. It is a starting orientation. The aim is not to strengthen one function at the expense of the others, but to allow the remaining movements to come online so the system can interlock fully. A coherent nervous system does not specialize indefinitely. It integrates. When the triad is operating cleanly, people often notice fewer repetitions of the same emotional lesson, insight that leads to real change, a calm that does not depend on certainty, and a quiet, grounding sense of joy. Difficulty and challenge still occur, but they no longer fragment the system or overwhelm the body that carries them. Living with the triadic nervous system does not require effort, techniques, or self-improvement strategies. It invites three simple permissions: allowing experiences to complete, allowing meaning to land in the body, and allowing clarity to settle before acting. The nervous system already knows how to do this. The triadic framework simply removes the pressure to override that intelligence. The individual triadic nervous system is not a new structure to be built. It is the original architecture through which learning occurs naturally. Coherence allows meaning to form. Translation allows meaning to live. And stabilization allows meaning to remain. When these three movements interlock, growth becomes sustainable, learning becomes humane, and consciousness evolves without breaking the body that carries it.